Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post-Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dehlia, and with me today is Vicar James.
Hey, y'all.
Today, we will be discussing the sermon from this past Sunday, Lent. We on Lent 5 now? Is that right?
Yeah, Lent 5.
Lent 5. So I have to ask you, Vicar, are you feeling ready for Holy Week and Easter?
Oh, how do you define ready?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Are you ready to preach and experience all the services?
Yeah, I am ready to experience it. We'll see when we get there.
With the preaching?
Yeah, with the preaching part. It's easy to think about it, in advance, but once you're in it, it's sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. But yeah, I'm ready to get there and see how it works out.
Excellent. We're all really excited. Okay, so let's talk about your sermon from yesterday. Tell me a little bit about what you preached on, the text.
Yeah, so this comes from Luke chapter 20. Jesus has just entered into the city of Jerusalem, and while he's there, he runs into some challenges. He's challenged by the authority, and so the authorities of the temple, the Jewish elders and the chief priests. He's speaking to the people, and he starts to tell this parable, the parable of the wicked tenants. You have these different characters. The owner, of course, is God, right? And that comes from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, all right? It's a direct relationship there where God calls Israel the Vineyard, all right? So he's speaking about Israel. And then the tenants are the religious leaders in the text, and then the servants are the prophets of God. And then, of course, Jesus is the beloved Son. And then he quotes Psalm 118. This is the stone that the builders have rejected, has become the cornerstone. Jesus is warning against the danger of rejecting the Messiah, right? He's right there in front of them, and he's giving him God's law, right, and telling them, these are the things that are going to happen to you if you reject the Messiah. So he uses this parable here to do that. In the context of what's going on, this text sits right in the middle of Jesus's dealings with the religious leaders of the day.
And something that you did that I thought was interesting in your sermon, I believe this was a new sermon structure for you. You spoke from the perspective of the scribe, the Jew, and the Roman.
Uh-huh.
Can you go into detail about that?
When I started to look at the text, I decided that it was kind of a hard text, first of all, because there's not a lot that's really applicable, right? That's obviously applicable in today's day. Speaking to Jewish leaders at the time, they don't really have the same kind of issues with God's will that we had. But I wanted to preach on the law, specifically our reaction to the law was just kind of how I felt the passage was going. And so immediately I noticed, the three characters in the story. You had Jesus telling the story. He's there. You've got the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. They're there. They react to it. And then also, interestingly enough, I actually misread the text the first time I read through it again, and that was at the very end of the parable. Jesus says that they're going to come, that the vineyard owner is going to come and take away the vineyard and destroy the tenants, right? And then it says they react. They cried out, "Surely not!" Right? And I just assumed when I first read it that was actually the scribes, right, calling out, but it's actually not. It's the people. When you go back to the very beginning of the text, it says Jesus was speaking to the people. And so you actually get a third character in here, the people, right? Because they're the ones listening to Jesus speaking. And so they're reacting in despair over his pronouncement. The scribes act in anger. And then Jesus is watching all this happen. And so then I added in the Roman, just for context, to put in, the idea of hope. So that's where we got the three different perspectives in there.
What was the problem that the sermon sought to identify?
The issue here is not so much the specific law that Jesus was telling to the scribes or to the people, it's the reaction, right? The law always shows us our sin, right? It accuses us of our sin, and it always finds us wanting. And because of this, we react to that in different ways, right? And that's what I was trying to bring out here. We see the scribe acting in anger because he's challenged by his sin, right? He doesn't think he's a sinner, right? In fact, so he becomes angry with Jesus and his words, and he runs off. Whereas the devout man, he understood that he was a sinner, but when Jesus says he's taken away the kingdom, right? At least that's what's implied there. He becomes despairing. He feels hopelessness, right? He doesn't think that there's any forgiveness left for him because Jesus is taking this away. And then when the Roman hears it, he suddenly figures out for the first time that he is a sinner, right? But in the parable, he hears hope because Jesus says, I'm going to give this vineyard to others, right? And so we see these different reactions to sin. And so the problem in the sermon is that how do we react to sin? How do we react to God's law, all right? And God doesn't come here out of malice to just tell us that we're sinners, right? And I'm going to crush you. What he does is he comes and he tells us our sin so that we can turn to him in repentance.
You mentioned the different reactions that you can react to the law in anger, despair, or like the Roman repentance, right? Mm-hmm. To have hope. In thinking about in that parable, is there gospel?
There is gospel in there, but it's really subtle actually, because it's very law heavy. But when you listen to the parable, what is God doing? He's continually coming to his people. God's salvation is standing there in the flesh, telling them the parable.
I have a question from a hearer about this parable. To clarify, you mentioned who the different people were in the parable. Let's talk specifically about the tenants. Who are the tenants?
So the tenants in this particular parable are the religious leaders of the day. I think it's tempting to extrapolate out and say that we could be the tenants in modern day, but Jesus is speaking directly to these people. And in addition to that, at the very end of the text we read, the scribes and the elders confirm that it is them that Jesus is talking about, because he says they perceive that he spoke this parable against them, right? Not even just about them, but against them personally, right? This is specifically a parable that he was speaking to them. Yeah, so while it's tempting to look at it, and I think that there's probably, some crossover there, but this parable, he's speaking directly to them.
Okay, so it's not necessarily talking about all of mankind or us here. Then I guess a follow-up question would be, how then does this parable apply to us?
When we look at the parable in general, it's God speaking the law. And so how does the parable apply? It's how we react to that law. How do we hear that law? And so like we talked about already, we react in different ways. We react in anger, despair, or hope.
We're really not that far from the chief priests and the scribes, right?
No, not really. Just a different law that's being preached.
Well, thank you. This wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to today's discussion. In case you missed today's sermon or want to listen to it again, the link to the sermon is in the show notes. You can also find the sermon on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. Or if you'd prefer to text a question, please text the phone number found in the show notes. Thank you, Vicar, for joining me and for feeding us a word this week.
Thanks for having me.
All right, bye.